most people in terms of hydrology think about simulating anywhere that's in the watershed, which is if you drop water on the surface and it were to flow over the surface, that would be within the Jordan River watershed. This watershed is also pretty unique in the sense that the water that flows out in the Jordan River, much of it comes from outside of the watershed. It's a groundwater area up there toward Alba and beyond. It's really conductive sediment. And although the surface goes one way, groundwater doesn't care. Groundwater flows down the slope of the water table. So there's this vast area that actually flows out into the Jordan River from up gradient. The other thing I want to point out on this map is this is the surface watershed of the Jordan River, basically from right outside here. This is the groundwater shed extending all the way out to here. So this whole area, the surface doesn't flow this way, but the groundwater does.
You definitely talked about the communication between the freshwater aquifer and the river and the watershed. What about the saline aquifers? Is there any communication or coordination between those two items?
So there's certainly some level of influence from the deeper groundwater system to the shallow groundwater system. And one of the things that we have is, so we have maps of what the different subsurface layers are, and we know from the oil industry that you've got these certain layers like shales that have low conductivity, basically cap that difference, that cap the two aquifers apart from each other, or in many cases we have a clay in between. And when we're modeling this system right now, we're modeling them as just the shallow system. But one of the things we're looking at is based on measurements of the water levels in the deep system and the shallow system, and what we know about the geology, looking at that influence and actually bring that into the groundwater model. It's actually, it can be one missing piece in our flows if there actually is that exchange from the deep system into our shallow system. That's a really important point.
Yeah, you say that groundwater is an important part of the source for the Jordan River, right? And that there's groundwater coming from outside the watershed. Mm-hmm. Do you have any percentages there about how much is groundwater and how much is groundwater coming outside of the watershed? I saw you had some...
I would guess that you have probably about 90% groundwater in this system, but the way to look at that would be looking at this particular plot is to say the groundwater component here, and this is actually very easy to do in the model, but let's just take based on the data, you say all of that part right below there, all of this is groundwater. And all of the stuff up here is that rain on very near the stream effect. So, there are peaks, but they're for very short periods of time. We've done this analysis for the entire Muskegon River water system, and we find, 85%?
85%.
So, and that includes floods, 85%. Here, you're probably even in the 95% range, maybe even more. That's a direct output we can actually get out of the model.
And then your part of the question about what fraction would come from outside the watershed is a really interesting one, and it's actually relevant to how groups like this work. I mean, if you're interested in the Jordan River itself, there's lots of pictures around here of the Jordan River watershed, but just looking at the recharge maps that we showed, areas of highest recharge in terms of the catchment for the Jordan River watershed are actually outside the watershed itself. So that's something I've written down. We'll actually run. What we'll do is we'll run an experiment in the simulation where we label the water going into that. We just add a tracer to it virtually, and then watch it come out in the stream. And we look at the concentration of that tracer in the virtual stream and say, well, is it 40%? Is it 70%?
Well, that area that's approaching that's outside the watershed, but is contributing groundwater, is approaching the really heavy snowbelt areas that are obviously replenishing a lot of streams.
That's right. Yeah, the annual precip there is the highest of anywhere in the watershed, according to the data that we were using as input.
And actually, to come back to your question about the percent, you can just look at this area here. So the area right down here is all outside of the surface watershed. It's probably about a third of the area upstream of Webster. But as you see, the recharge is higher, so it might account for even as much as, say, half of the actual flow at Webster. So, pretty big number.
Yeah, some of the groundwater travel times in this area, we haven't actually run the calculations, but I'm sure they're in the order of many hundreds of years from water to enter the ground till where it comes back out in the stream.